Thank you so much for coming to my talk. I hope you had a great coffee break, because I certainly did. So I'm here to talk about Storybook and testing. And my name is Yann Braga, that guy, just longer hair. And I work for Chromatic, which is a cloud-based service for Storybook users that want to test their stuff using visual regression testing. And I am one of the maintainers of Storybook. So the first question, just before I start, I just wanted to know who here knows about Storybook? Yeah, that's a lot. But out of you guys, who actually uses Storybook? Okay, that's still a lot. So thank you so much for using Storybook. That certainly will help my talk. Okay, so I guess most of you know that UI issues are pretty much inevitable. The front-end development has become so complex that essentially, even to make a simple app, you need to know about the architecture of your application, know what components you should reuse, what components you should not. And while building your components, you might still get a bit lost on what's going on there. There are so many different variables to take into account. There are different viewports, different browsers, different kinds of platforms, mobile, desktop, and so on and so forth. We have heard a lot of people talking about accessibility as well. And essentially, now, just to build a button, it might take you like a month. So it's pretty important to start thinking about how you cope with that situation. So I wanted to know, first of all, who here tests their components? That is great. You're all doing a great job. For the ones who didn't raise your hands, let's hope that you you raise them the next time. So if you're testing your components, you're most likely using a tool such as Playwright, Storybook, Cypress, or you might be using testing library as well. And we have a picture from Horacio. He gave a talk earlier on about building UI more confidently. So if you, who went to that talk, by the way? Oh, that's amazing. So I think you can just go now. I'm going to talk about something similar. But thank you so much, Horacio. So first of all, when talking about component testing, there are so many different kinds of tests that you can do. There are visual testing, interaction testing, accessibility testing, composition, and user flows. There are so many things that you can do just by using component testing. But in this talk, I'm just going to be focusing on interaction. So there is a very known pattern of testing called the AAA. And I wanted to know if any of you can shout what those three A's mean. Assert. Arrange and act. That's perfect. Thank you so much. So when thinking of the anatomy of a test, you normally have those three steps. And they're pretty important to know. So first of all, you might be providing mock, props, or some data for your components. If you're using Angular, you have different inputs. And if you're using React or Vue, you have props and such. It's pretty much the same thing. You're just setting up the necessary data for your component to render in the state of which you want. The act is pretty much when you want to render your component, so you want to make sure that it's actually rendering correctly, and you're also interacting with it. And after you're interacting with your components, you want to be sure that you can verify the outcome. So for instance, if I click on a button, does that pop up a model? Does the model exist after I click on the component? If not, then probably my tests are failing. So it's pretty important to be able to structure your tests and write them in an easy way so that you get more confidence. So first of all, who here, when testing their components, are using testing library? And who is not using testing library, what are you using? Spectator, nice. So when it comes to using testing library, when you think about writing a test, actually that also works for other scenarios, but I'm just going to use testing library as an example. You have, first of all, you have to isolate your component, and then you set up the test case. Then you need to simulate your interactions. You're probably going to use testing library and user event, and then you can run your assertions using Jest. So that's great. It's pretty nice. But at the same time, it takes a lot of work to set up the isolated test cases. So this is an example of a code that we maintain. And we're essentially testing a model, but that page needs a bunch of setup to actually render correctly. So you need to have a router to wrap the correct routes. You need to have a theme provider because the components are using React style components or emotion, for instance. And you also need to use a story provider because you might be using some state management tools. So in order just to render that page, you need to make sure to set up the whole thing. Now, this is fine when you do once, but then every time that you're creating your tests, you also have to set up those things. And if you are using other tools such as Storybook, you might be doing pretty much the same thing. So that's pretty much duplicating the setup. So what if there is a tool that helps you isolate those test cases, but with a great visual feedback? Because, in testing library, you might be writing all of these things. Why am I not seeing that slide? Yeah. You might be writing all of these things, but you're not visualizing what exactly is going on. If there's an error, you're only seeing the errors in the CLI. So Storybook is pretty much a tool that helps you isolate your components, but then in a very nice visualized way. So with Storybook, you have, you all know about Storybook, but for the ones that don't know about it, you can render your components in isolation, and then you're going to get this really nice sidebar on the left, and you have extra functionality, such as changing the themes of your components. You could check the documentation, because you can also write stuff for your teammates to understand more how to use them, as well as many other things that Storybook can do. It can also help you test accessibility. It can help you connect with design tools. It can help you with so many things that actually the community keeps on bringing every day. There are over 350 community add-ons in Storybook, and that keeps on growing and growing. So I already asked that question, so thanks a lot for answering prior to that. So Storybook is an open source tool, and will always be an open source tool that is built and maintained by over 1,500 contributors. And I don't know, maybe one of them is actually you, or it could be you. That would be super nice, and I would be really happy to help. And also, Storybook is used by thousands and thousands of companies. And these are just a few examples that you can see. And they're all being using Storybook in many different setups, many different configurations, such as Vue projects, React projects, Angular projects, and so on and so forth. So Storybook has been pretty much the tool for building component libraries in design systems. But a lot of people don't know that Storybook is also for apps. So if you can render your component in isolation, that basically means that it doesn't matter what the component is. So you can as well just have an entire page. So here's an example of me with an entire page that is very interactive, and I can test it, the whole thing, just in isolation. But I can also test different network states, such as an error or 404. And I'm using utility tools that mock the requests so that I can reach those scenarios. Like, when testing loading scenarios, I'm pretty sure some of you have gone through this frustration. Like, let's suppose you just made that super nice loading animation with like a Pac-Man, and you want to show your PO. Oh, let me show you this feature. Do you keep on like refreshing the browser to show the loading state, but that takes like 2 seconds and it goes away? How do you make sure that you can actually catalog those states visually without having any other effort? So Storybook is just one example. So as you can see, I'm pretty much documenting all of the scenarios which are important for my page, and I'm able to go all the way to the level of that page. So I have simple components such as a button, all the way to an app. So for the ones who don't know about Storybook, it uses the concept of stories, which are pretty much test cases for everything that a component does. So in Storybook, you have a file called the component name, such as a button.stories.ts or JS or TSX, whatever extension you might be using. And then it has two constructs. The first one is called the meta, which is where you export a default object mentioning which component you're using. And then you have named exports that will contain the configuration of your component. So we have the construct of args, which is pretty much the same as props or inputs in Angular, for instance. And you basically pass that information to Storybook, and that's going to render a component on the left side. As you can see, primary has primary true in a label of button, so then you can render that component and mount it directly in the browser. So if you come back to the anatomy of a test, when it comes to using Storybook and rendering components in isolation, you're pretty much using this, a range is pretty much a story. And, And the act and assert is something that you probably are doing manually. So if you have that page as an example and you click on a button, you see a modal opening, you might be doing that manually. Sometimes that's not great. because you don't want to be doing that work every single time you make changes. So in Storybook, you're actually able to reuse your stories in your tests, and that could also be many other integration tools. As an example, you can reuse your stories in tests using testing library and Jest in JS with Node. So you can write the test cases as stories where you can visualize them very nicely in the browser as you develop them. Then you can import into Jest with a utility that we call, we just import because the stories file is just a JavaScript file. And then we have utilities such as the Storybook Testing React package, where it provides a compose stories and a compose story functions, where you can essentially reconstruct that story and the configuration you've done in Storybook, but now to be used in other platforms. In this case, you're using with JS tests. And then essentially your setup, if you remember the last slide, which had like so many lines, your setup becomes just one line. And then the compose stories function returns all of your states. So that's pretty nice because it's kind of like when you go to a restaurant and then you have a menu of options to choose. Compose stories provides you all of the different stories, which are different states of your components to choose from. And then you basically only focus on writing the interaction and the assertion, which is honestly what you care the most when you're writing tests. So that is great, and you can run the assertions using Jest and JS. However, the experience, and I'm pretty sure most of you know about it, is not really great because you're still using JS in your tests, which is not a real browser, so some APIs might be lacking, or you're not able to test anything visually there, such as color contrasts and other things. And if the test fails, all you get is this like not great blob of HTML to debug, and God forbid if you have like an SVG and then the whole markup is there, it's difficult to visualize. I'm not sure about you, but I cannot parse that into something visual. So if you have that frustration just like I do, you might be feeling that debugging your UI issues is just clunky. It's kind of like you're using a PS5, but you're playing a text adventure game. So it works, sure, it's nice, it might be fast, but at the same time, every single time there's a failure, you're going to go through the same frustrations. So what if you could run the same tests, but instead directly in the browser? Well, you might be telling me there are many tools, and actually Storybook is just one of them. So it's been about 1 year since we released the feature called interaction tests in Storybook, and we have been increasingly upgrading and updating the experience there. So interaction tests with Storybook, they use a new annotation called the play function, which I'll show you in detail later. And it's powered by testing library because, if you are already writing tests using Jest and testing library, you might not want to learn yet a new concept. And it will simulate the user behavior in the browser directly, and you can still write assertions using Jest. The only difference is you're not using Jest as a runner, just as an assertion library. And there's less maintenance because now you're not duplicating your code. So here's just an example of a button. Once you click on it, you open a modal, but you don't want to just have to do that manually. You want to automate it. So this is an example of a story. As you've seen before, it had a few constructs. Args is one example, but your component might not receive any props. So you can have the new construct called the play function, of which it receives this canvas element. It's the wrapping element, a DOM element of your story. And then you can essentially write something very, very similar than what you had before. So I'm just clicking on a button that has a rolled button with the name delete customer, and I expect the are you sure element to be in the document. And I'm using the Storybook wrappers for both testing library and Jest, which are provided so that they can be instrumented and they're browser compatible so that you can keep on using your stuff but working really well in Storybook. So if you have that, and we also provide an add-on called interactions and you install it in your projects, you're also going to be able to visualize exactly what are the steps directly in the browser. So as you can see here, we have the delete customer button, and then at the bottom it says runs. So the interaction is going to run. And then as it runs, you see the behavior happening as well as the step passing. So if it fails, you're also getting the same feedback from the CLI, but now you're actually seeing what exactly is happening in a very visual way. So the add-on interactions also provides you ways to debug your interactions with playback controls. And that's pretty cool because you can actually step back and forth through the interactions, and you can visualize exactly what has been defined for that interaction in your components. And if there's any error there, you can just debug them directly in the browser. So in order to make this a little more visual, I'm just going to give a quick demo to you. And I hope the demo gods are happy with me. So here's an example of a application. It's kind of like an Uber Eats. It's called Meal Drop. And you can essentially view your restaurants. You can select some category. I really like burgers, so I'm just going to go for that. And once you select your restaurant, you have to select some stuff to eat, a cheeseburger, sure, some fries. And then I can go to my checkout page, of which I need to fill some forms. And then let me just quickly fill my forms. And I'm just going to complete this. It's just a fake application, don't worry. And then I can go to the end of my flow. So this application, as you can see, there are many UI elements around it. We have a carousel, we have a restaurant card, which could be reused in other pages. We have some buttons, and we have different theming. So all of these things are pretty nice, and you can see them as you run the application, but you might as well also catalog them and see them in isolation. So as I go to my Storybook route, because I deployed my Storybook here as well, I am able to see all of my components in isolation, such as a category component, a button component, and I can play around with the args so that they can actually just change the rendering behavior over there. And when I go to something more complex, such as, let's say, my restaurant detail page, I have a success scenario that is just rendering my component of my page. However, I also have a with modal open story, which essentially is opening the modal for me. But in order to open this modal, I had to write an interaction. So I'm going to show you very quickly what the code looks like. And I might make this just a little bigger so it's more visible. But essentially, once I have a canvas of which I can select stuff from, I can do find by text, where I want to find an element that has a name cheeseburger. I want to click on that element, and I want to expect that a modal exists in the document. That's a pretty simple thing to do, and it only involves these 3 steps. And then as you can see over here on the add-on panel on the right, and I'm just going to make this a little bigger as well, you will see that there are 3 steps over here, which are pretty much the same steps as I defined in my code. But the thing is, this Storybook is actually deployed online. I'm not running this locally, although I could. But I'm still able to execute all of the tests I wrote. And if there's any failure in that test, I can actually go back and go forward step by step and see them happening in real time. And just for the fun of it, I'm currently in the step that it clicks, and it's going to expect that a modal exists. But I'm just going to close this, and then I'm going to go to the next step. So I now have a failure, because essentially, my element could not be found in the document. So there's something wrong. And if that was actually the case, I could just access my Storybook in this story and visualize both what interactions are actually passing and which interaction is failing, but also I get the visual state of my component rather than just a blob of HTML. So hopefully that helps visualize what we have so far in Storybook. But then you could tell me something like, yeah, that's nice, but I don't want to be accessing Storybook and accessing each story to see whether that story has an interaction and whether the interaction is passing or not. So in order to make things easier for you, we also developed a Storybook test runner. So the test runner is powered by Playwright and Jest. So it both uses Jest as a test runner because you can reuse your Jest configuration, but also uses Playwright for headless or headed testing. And it will run all of the tests in parallel via the command line because you can get pretty much all of the power that Playwright provides, and you get watch mode and filters and all of the things that Jest provides to you. The nice thing is you can get this very cool headed experience, but for testing, you might not care about that because you're running things in CI, and you can have this headed experience. But then you tell me, like, isn't that just going back to the same problem as before? Well, not really, because first of all, Storybook is going to convert every single one of your stories into tests, and whether the stories contain the play function or not, just the fact that the story is rendered correctly is already a test that we call the smoke test. And it also is going to verify the interactions and the assertions. And I don't know why my other slide was not visible, so I'm sorry about that. Yeah, there you go. So you could use the test runner with cross-browser testing, because Playwright provides tests for all of the platforms and all of them happening parallel, which is really cool. But even if you wanted to have that experience, you might not want to have the hassle of figuring out what the bug is if you have a failure in CI. And in CI, you might get, sure, that blob of text in the HTML that I showed you before. But you might want to get a better experience so you can visualize what the problem is. So a lot of different testing tools, they normally rely on generating videos. So for instance, oh, my tests are failing. Let me see what it happened. And then you have to download a video. You open the video, and sometimes you get to see what's going on. But some other times, maybe the scrolling didn't happen that well, and then the video actually didn't mean anything. So then you need to figure out what's going on by yourself. So with Storybook, we have this click to debug feature, which is essentially a way to, once there is a failure in any of your interactions or any of your stories, there's going to be a text, and I hope you can visualize. I'm just going to make it a little bigger, that tells you, well, there was an error, and it occurred in the following story. So you actually get the entire URL of your story, and you get the error at the bottom. You could get the logs that come with it. But then if you just click on that URL, it opens Storybook directly in the error, and you can easily visualize what's going on. If you deploy your Storybook via your CI, you can also get that URL. And instead of relying on getting a video, you actually get the real experience running in the browser and failing directly in the browser. That makes it so much simpler for you to actually debug what's going on, because you can essentially just use the browser. Is there a failure in my network? Well, I can just check the network requests as they happen in my interaction. Is it a failure in my code? I could actually just add a breakpoint to it and then debug it right away. So a lot of people have been talking about accessibility, and I know I said I was just going to talk about interaction, but I added this slide as I saw so many talks about accessibility. In Storybook, there is one add-on that you can install. It's called the accessibility add-on, and it tests for accessibility. Essentially, it both tells you, and as you can see over here, I am rendering a form component, and at the bottom, I have both the number of accessibility violations, the accessibility passes, and maybe some incomplete accessibility checks which are happening. And I also get to see which one are happening, and if as I click on the check, it actually highlights which element is not properly accessible, and as I click on that particular accessibility error, I also get, and I don't know why this is not really synced, so just bear with me for a second. Oh, there you go. So you also get to see more details about your accessibility failure, as well as a button called More Info that goes to the DECU University website that teaches you how to actually fix your accessibility problems. So that is really cool, but once again, it's kind of like the same thing, like I can see my failures, but do I need to do them manually? Well, actually not, because the Storybook test runner contains some test hooks that allow you to do some random or extra stuff as you pre-render your story and after you post-render. So you can customize and extend the test runner to do pretty much anything you want. You could do snapshot testing, you could do accessibility testing, you could pretty much name it. And here's an example of a accessibility testing using these hooks, where I use the Axe Playwright library. I basically, before rendering my component, I inject Axe to the page. And by the way, the page which comes from this hook is the playwright page, so you can essentially do anything you want with it as well. And after the component has been rendered, I check the accessibility of it. So very honestly, I'm also an imposter. I don't check accessibility very often, but is there someone who also doesn't check accessibility very often? Is there anyone who checks accessibility often? Congratulations, I'm your fan. So accessibility is very important, and a lot of people have been talking about it every day in every conference, everywhere. But we keep on just listening, but we never really do much about it. Storybook, if you just add this add-on and you're using Storybook, every single time you're going to get reminded that there are things that you can improve. So hopefully that's one step further to educate more engineers. So if you're using the test runner, you can also get code coverage reports, because you might be asking me like, oh, so if I don't need to write my tests in Jest and JSDOM, and I'm writing them in Storybook, but how do I keep my code coverage? Because code coverage might be important. It might be a very important KPI for your team. Well, actually, you can still get code coverage using the test runner. And the nice thing about code coverage, for the ones who don't know about it, is that as you run your stories and you execute the tests, you actually get a report that you can check locally in your browsers, which essentially shows the raw source of your component, as well as which part of your code has not executed after your component rendered. And that basically means that you're not testing, let's say, the loading state. And maybe that's very important. And this report tells you what exactly you need to test. And that's also available with Storybook. And the nicest thing even is that the code coverage is something that a lot of people use with other tools such as CodeCov. And that also is picked up automatically as you use Storybook. And you can get really nice reports directly in your pull requests, let's say. And then you can even have checks that tell you, like, you can only merge this thing if the threshold is set correctly. So if you have less coverage as you add more components, you're not going to be able to merge stuff. And I know some people are not happy about that. But it's always nice to keep in mind that you should be properly testing your components. So when we come back to the anatomy of a story, prior to knowing about all of these things, probably you already thought, oh, Storybook is only for buttons, and it's only for checkboxes, only for simple things. So my arrange is just the only part that Storybook provides in the anatomy of a test. But actually now, you get all of these things just by using Storybook. So all of the 3 steps are getting executed by the Storybook test runner, and then you basically increase your confidence. Even if you never have written any interaction tests for your components, but if you're using Storybook, just the fact of installing the Storybook test runner and running it, maybe in CI or something, it will already tell you whether your components are working. So I'm pretty sure, who here has had any frustration when they upgraded one library and that happened to break stuff you didn't even know? Suppose you're updating something like Material UI from 3 to 4 or whatever, and you're only running, like just checking whether your components render. That's enough to tell you whether your migration has worked or not. So I know that I am only talking about interaction tests, but Storybook has so many more things. You can integrate so many other tools to it, and you can get so much more value of it. But I really wanted to make sure that you get this new experience, which we are providing. And we are improving it every single day, and as you give us feedback, we can make it even better. So if you want to know more about testing, we actually have incredible maintainers that write really excellent tutorials, and you can find them in the storybook.js.org website /tutorials. There's many chapters and many books for different kinds of things to do in Storybook. One of them is about UI testing. And I'm just going to leave this for a second while I take a sip of water. And also, these books are translated in many languages. So I just wanted to be sure to show you all of these things, but I am open to any questions if you have. And thank you so much for looking at my talk. I'm definitely not keeping track of the time, and I don't know how much time I have. So if somebody knows, let me know. Yeah?
So I noticed pretty early on in the talk, there's a format that you have. It's like a standard that I guess Chromatic created. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. The question was, one of my slides contained a file with some standard, and was it Chromatic who created it, or let me just tell you about the format. So Storybook is a tool that uses a format for a story file. We call it the component standard format. It's CSF. And it's essentially exactly what you said. There is one object which is default exported. And I'm just going to show you because it's a little easier. Oh, that talk was really nice, I guess. So you have this default export that you can declare a bunch of stuff. And this is just a very simple example, but you can declare decorators, you can declare args, you can declare loaders, and many other things that Storybook provides. And that essentially is the way to explicitly declare what is involved in your component. And that is applied to every single story. And then as you create stories, as you can see, there's a primary on dark, and secondary. Those are specific annotations for your single story. The idea behind this format is to make things as declarative as possible, and also not dependent on any vendors. So as you can see here, this is just a JavaScript file. There's nothing Storybook related. It's just importing a component and exporting some objects. That's pretty much it. So we created the component standard format. There is another organization called Component Driven. And it's a format that we are trying to get as many tools to use it as possible. You can check this website if you're interested as well. And there are many different integrators that are working with that format. In fact, Backlight, which is a very interesting tool that also follows the same format for web components, for instance. So that format just allows you to declare something for your stories. And that, given it's a format and a standard, a lot of other integrators can use it to create their own solutions. So this way, we don't have just Storybook in one place, but that format can be used in even competitors. Actually, there are competitors that use the same format. The nicest thing is that we are basically helping people to think more about components and component-driven development, and the CSF is just a facilitator for that. No worries. Yeah?
So you showed how in CI I can get the errors if there's any. What happens if I test my components in multiple browsers? Does that gonna also show like this component failed with this browser with this version, so you can open I don't know what if you don't have that browser installed, or
all right.
How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, if I am using Storybook for testing and I am setting things in CI, and the failure only happens in one of the browsers, how do I know exactly what is going on? So as part of the feedback, and I'm not sure if I have an image that provides that well, but as you can see here, I see which browser this is actually running on. But in terms of like what's the version of the browser and things like that, then you probably could, because this is Playwright, so you could probably pass some extra log level flags or something like that, which will provide such information for you. And so the thing about being able to click to debug and see the error directly, there is a prerequisite, of course, which is deploying your Storybook somewhere. So you could either deploy your Storybook as a static, as part of your CI process, which could be I'm deploying on Vercel, or I'm deploying on Netlify, or something like that. Or you could use Chromatic, which is a hosting platform that basically you can set up for free. And then you have Storybook deployments per commit, per branch in your projects. So as you get the URLs that come out of those deployments, which could either be Chromatic, Vercel, or Netlify, you could pass that URL as a parameter to the test runner, and then the feedback that you get is going to use that URL. So if you don't want to do that at all, it's still fine. The only thing is that you cannot click and debug. You are going to have to run Storybook locally, and you just copy the URL, and that's going to work as well. So I hope that answers the question. And I think the gentleman in yellow had a question, or maybe not. All right. I think he was just saying hi. Hi. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, in the code you showed like you use within and then the canvas element. What happens if you render portals, for example, outside the canvas element?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm going to do a very small demo just to provide a little more visuals. So the question was, in the code as I showed, I am defining a canvas, and then from the canvas I am using that to query my elements. So normally when you're writing tests in testing library, people tell you, oh, you should not use very specific queries, you should use screen. And in testing library, screen is essentially a way to get an element based on document.body. But the thing is, Storybook is just not a tool to show one component and that's it. You can actually have documentation that provides many components at the same time in the screen. So if you're running a test and you're also planning to render the component with other same components in the same page, your test is probably going to fail because it's going to find so many button elements. So the reason we created this canvas element and we ask people to use canvas within is just to avoid such clash. So this way, you can have many components, many stories that have different interactions and query for the same element, and they're not going to fail. But that doesn't actually block you from using screen. So if I wanted, I could come to my imports from Storybook testing library. I could just import screen. And instead of using my canvas, I could just delete it and use screen. This way, any portaled elements which are outside of the DOM structure of the story are going to be picked up as well. And that would be totally fine. Yeah. Yes? How does the documentation work? That's a very, very broad question. So do you want to know like the deep inside of like how does the documentation work, or what are the features that the documentation? All right. So the documentation from Storybook uses many different tools to try to gather metadata about your components depending on your framework. So if you're using React, it's going to use React DocGen. If you're using Vue, Vue DocGen. If you're using Angular, CompoDoc, and many others. So this is a button component, and if I open my button, the file of my button, you're going to see that I have a type for my props, and I'm just going to make this a little bigger. And as you can see, there are some comments here. In fact, let me just turn this into light theme. Yeah. Does that hurt your eyes? All right, so maybe this is a little bit, I don't know. Sorry about that. So as you can see, I'm adding some JS doc here. So I'm adding some comments on top of my properties, and as well as adding some comments on top of my component. So if you like to do that, because you might be working, for instance, in a component library team, and the components you're building are actually to be consumed by other people, the documentation is going to be picked up automatically. So as you can see, this is the name of my component. This is the comment of which I added over here. And for each and every of my properties, as you can see here as well, the documentation is there. So I could add my extra comments, but if I don't, it's totally fine. I get essentially the exact type of each of my properties. I can also like play around with the properties right here. So if this is a clear button, I can click here and set the property to true. And just because I want a demo, this is not working. I'm not sure why, but trust me, you would get an experience similar to the controls over here, that you can change the visual styles of your components. And you're going to also click on the show code to visualize what the code would look like for that component. And that also works for the different variants of your components. There are many other features that you can add as well into your Storybook, and that really depends on the types of add-ons that you install. Thank you. Now I know that I have 5 minutes. So I hope that answers your question. And in fact, for Storybook 7, which hopefully is going to be around soon at the end of the year, or maybe early next year. I cannot promise anything. It's open source. We are planning to do a whole revamp on the documentation experience because, for most people, the documentation within Storybook is good, but for like hardcore component library developers that are working in a big corporation, they don't want to have a Storybook UI for their documentation. They want to have their own website with one route that goes to a documentation. So we have, that's one of the guys. We have a new project we call Docs 2.0, which is essentially going to allow you to use your stories from Storybook, but render them totally outside of Storybook in your own Next.js documentation website. And then you can have whatever feature you want, basically. Thank you. Yes?
I know there's an MDX also format. How does the MDX format work for interactions?
The MDX format, and thanks for mentioning that. I don't have a lot of examples for MDX, and I don't think this theme works that well. So I'm just going to bring it back to what it was. I think it was this one. Yeah. Is that better? I hope. OK, so MDX is essentially a format that allows people to write Markdown alongside React. And you could potentially have some block elements from Storybook, and I can show you how it looks like, for instance, here. Because you might want to actually have your custom documentation, such as showing different types of typography, or showing a list of colors of your components in light and dark mode, and looking at how they look like, what is the hex code, but also what's the theme, what's the way to access those themes. And this is pretty useful for people who are not building the actual themes and the base components, so they might be a little lost. And this is achievable by using MDX. So MDX is just a format that mixes Markdown and React elements. Essentially, you could write your own non-component documentation, such as just the colors, but you could also write a documentation using your stories. And when you're using your stories, you're also going to import what we call the story elements, and then also the meta element, because we're following the same standard as the CSF. So you have a meta, which we call the export default, and then we have a story, which is a named export. So you just follow the same thing. So you would have a meta and a story, and the story would have the title and whatever, but then every single other construct, such as the args and whatnot, they could be passed just normally here, and that would also include the play function. So the play function would be an asynchronous function that you could pretty much do the same thing here, and that would just work as well. I could probably show a very quick example in the Storybook codebase. Add-on interactions MDX. I probably typed it really bad. Interactions MDX. .stories. I don't think I have an example ready right now, but essentially it's the same. You would have the same construct, and you could just define it in MDX. No worries. So yeah, thanks a lot, everybody. Thank you so much for watching the talk and still staying here until I talk all of these random stuff. And I wish you have a great end of the conference.